Okay, we're going to start with God's help, and when Alicia comes, she knows where to come now. All right, so we are going to explore Kabbalah and Chassidism in the next 90 minutes. And I would say, and what some people assume about Kabbalah is that it begins in the medieval period. That the first time that we have the term Kabbalah being used for the mystical tradition, it begins to snowball in that post-Maimonides period, the 1200s. But the reality is that Judaism has always had a mystical tradition. Whether we call it Kabbalah or not, we read a week or two, even before the Zohar, in the Torah, they looked up and they saw like sapphire, God's throne. You have Ezekiel's vision of angels and a chariot and wheels with eyes and 6 wings, and they're seeing the to and fro of the angels. They're seeing visions. They're seeing visions in the Torah. So here's the thing: it's very important to recognize that there is and there was a mystical tradition in how to be a prophet. There were techniques that Jews had in schools of prophecy. So how do you have a vision? How do you become fit for prophecy? Was something that they were doing. It wasn't just a miracle, someone's touched with a wand. They had tradition. Now, you going through the Talmud, there were sages, mystics in the Talmud who were having what we call a sense of the soul, going up. We read on Yom Kippur in our prayers, the 10 martyrs. The story is that the king has decreed against 10 of the Jewish leaders to be killed. And they pick Rabbi Yishmael, the high priest, to go up to heaven and find out if this decree is one that we can overturn or not. Is it sealed? And he goes up to heaven and he speaks to an angel, and the angel tells him, I have heard from behind the curtain that this is a decree. So in the Talmud, this is not the only one. In the Talmud, you have descriptions of sages making a sense of the soul, which is some sort of vision, some sort of communication, a two-way communication. It's not just prayer. It's a two-way communication where heaven is communicating with them. So this exists. You have in the Talmud stories of Choni the circle maker, for example. Is a whole genre of miracle workers, of rabbis of the Talmud, who are not known necessarily as the greatest Torah sages, but they're known as the great miracle workers. Choni the circle maker makes a circle, and he says, stands in the middle of it and says, God, I'm not going to leave the circle until you make it rain. This is in time of drought, and it begins to rain, begins to pour. And then he even prays it's too much rain, and it stops. And Rabbi Gamliel says, if you weren't Choni the circle maker, God's buddy, God's child in his home, I would have excommunicated you, because he was busy telling God, too much rain, too little rain, a little bit too much of. My point is, there are miracle workers, there are mystics, there are visionaries, there are people who are going up to the higher realms. In the Tanakh, we have that with the prophets are doing that. We have it in the Talmud. And if you remember the periods, from Moses is 3,300 years ago. So the first temple period is time of King David, King Solomon, all the way until Jeremiah. Okay? So in other words, 2,500 years ago is the end of the first temple period. You have prophets then. And then the beginning of the second temple, Mordechai, Malachi, you have the end of the prophet period. So the prophets are then, and then the next 500 years, going down into the Talmudic period till the year 200, and then till the year 500 is Mishnah and Talmud. And we read about these sages having these mystical experiences and mystical techniques. And then the next period, from 500 to 1,000, the Gaonic period, it goes dark, but not really. There are letters. You could read letters that they've excavated, and that some were transmitted, some were found in the Cairo Geniza, others were known conversations where people were asking questions about certain divine names, certain meditations. that were being done by, they were asking for methodology, and they say, the Talmud says these type of secrets, we whisper mouth to ear. These are not said in a collective, in a collective. These are mouth to ear. They're secrets of the Torah only given to the holy, to the pure, to those who understand. We're going to give you hints. We're not even going to reveal it. In other words, there's something called concealed wisdom that is being transmitted within Judaism. Clearly, what is that body of knowledge? We can debate, but there was for sure an understanding that thing existed. We touched on Maimonides. Any thoughts before we go further? Yes.
So they weren't written down.
Right. So that becomes the question. They're not written down because even the oral Torah, that's a very important thing. Even the oral Torah was initially meant to be oral. Shalom, shalom. So even the oral Torah was meant to be oral. And even when the Mishnah was composed, it was still memorized. And even when the Talmud was composed, many memorized it. Maimonides wanted his book to be memorized. Rabbi Yosef Kar wanted. So memorization was not far into this culture. So the idea that secrets of the Torah are given hand to hand, mouth to ear, it was something that's not so outrageous. Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, made a claim we read last week. It's in the book here. We're going to see it in a moment. He makes a claim that some of these things were lost. That because it was mouth to ear, and because it was said in symbols, so therefore, because of our persecution, we lost some of the mystical knowledge. So he says, I'm going to recreate using little hints from the Torah, little hints from the rabbis, using reason and logic and Greek metaphysics. I'm going to recreate some of these ideas to make it understood to people like us. So Maimonides is saying it was forgotten. The mystics are saying it wasn't forgotten. We got it. I remember, I don't want to go off on this tangent. Okay, let's take a quick look. The tangent was that when I was a kid growing up in California, Jews for Jay made a campaign. These were Hebrew Christian missionaries. They had a campaign all over, big billboards that said, we found it. We found it. No one knew what it was. And then all of a sudden they said, we found it. It was JC. So the Jews for Judaism, which was a new movement, there was a Chabad organization for combating cults. They made a billboard that said, we never lost it. You found it. We never lost it. We always had it. This becomes a question. We know there's an oral tradition about Torah, and we know that we kept the oral tradition of Torah. The question becomes about these mystics, about this mystical teaching. The fact there is a tradition is pretty clear. That's number one step. Number two is that it was transmitted in a certain way. So let's take a look. Let's see if these things are working. My computer's acting up. Okay, so the timeline here is just to show you, we covered in the first class, we covered Midrashic work, then Talmud, then Halachic works, then Musar and philosophy. Now we're Kabbalah and Chassidism. So there are two different words used for the mystical. Kabbalah, which means received, and Sod, which means secret. So there are two different meanings that are really at the core of this type of tension. These things are being transmitted, but they're also being done secretly. So this is something which for us today is hard to understand because we are post the revelation of what we call the hidden wisdom. It's no longer hidden. Everything's published. Everything's printed. Everything's explained. They'll take the deepest mystical ideas. Everything's on the internet. Everything is there. But there was a time where people trembled to put it into writing. And not just that, to prepare yourself to study that text. You have to fast. You have to be holy. You have to go to mikvah. It was a whole thing. It was a whole type of preparation to be engaged in this type of wisdom. Yes?
Was it that you would have to be 40 or older?
So it's an interesting thing. It's said often about being 40 and older. The 40 and older, I don't know if you remember, in philosophy, the Rajba, when he was combating what was happening in his time period after Maimonides, they made a prohibition against studying philosophy before 40. In other words, this idea at certain points where 40 was seen as the age does exist. It does become common understanding. It was after the debacle in 1666 with Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah, where he used Kabbalistic ideas, where it became very common, this idea of not being 40. But earlier, the great Kabbalist, we're going to talk about him, Ba'arizal, said, all these prohibitions no longer exist. It's a mitzvah now to reveal this wisdom. There is no question there is a change in the approach towards the mystical secrets, going from the Talmudic time, where it was whispered mouth to ear, to the beginning of the 1200s, when the manuscripts begin to flow, till the printing press, when it was a whole new genre of mystical writings, and until the flow of Hasidism. And each time there was pushback about how much of these mystical secrets are you making available, accessible, and how much are you running the risk of people misunderstanding them or misusing them. So I know this is a slightly different topic. There's something they call practical Kabbalah and theoretical Kabbalah. Practical Kabbalah would be using names of God to effectuate change by harnessing powers of angels or other such things, which in general was seen as dangerous and not ideal by the great Kabbalists. But these type of ideas did exist. They did exist. There are many different names of God. There's a 72-letter name of God. There's a 45. There's Man, Ban, 52. There are different names of God, and each name represents a different attribute of the divine. And there are ways that they would meditate on certain things and say certain things that they believe could effectuate certain changes. Now, you would have to be holy too. We're going to get to this idea of a book called the Book of Formation, which the Talmudic scholars seem to know of, that they believe they can manipulate creation and create things using names of God. Well, we're going to get to that. But theoretical Kabbalah is what becomes the norm, which is an understanding of how God interacts with the world, how every mitzvah you do has an effect and has meaning and purpose, and what the relationship between you, God, and the spiritual realms are, and how everything has purpose and meaning and significance. Every little detail of every commandment, every word of the Torah has these mystical accomplishments that are affected in the higher realms. When I put on tefillin, I'm causing a flow from on high of a certain type. I'm causing what they call unifications. I'm getting way ahead of myself, but that's the gist of it, is that this is another important element. In other religions, the mystic is trying to break free from the constraints of law. In other religions, the mystic wants to experience the divine, and orthodoxy wants to keep you in a box. In Judaism, the greatest mystics were the greatest legalists. We're going to go through some of the names later on. The greatest codifiers of Jewish law, post-Maimonides, are the greatest Kabbalists of Judaism. And this is why people have those people who want to separate mysticism from Judaism have a big problem, because the greatest transmitters of traditional Judaism are not just legalists, they're mystics. For example, Rabbi Yosef Karo, from Safat, who makes the Code of Jewish Law. And before that, he wrote the commentary on the Torah. He is the ultimate in a stickler for Jewish law. He writes a diary of the mystical, spiritual voice of the Mishnah that communicates with him, an angel he has a diary of communications with this angel, predicting things, telling him things, what he should do, what revelations. So this is the lawyer and the mystic, the same guy. He's just wearing a different tool belt. He's not using mysticism to determine Jewish law. He's not using his magid. His magid that's a term used for this angelic type of voice that's communicating wisdom to him. He's not using that to determine Jewish law, but it's part and parcel of Judaism. No one says this wasn't him. No one says it's a book that was made up. It was stolen from his house, and they have other corroborations from other rabbis of that same time period, that he had an angel that spoke to him, and they heard the voice coming out of his mouth, and he predicted different things. How it works exactly, gets vested in the person or whatever it is secondary. But these guys were super mystics as well as being super legalists. From the period of 1500 and on, you cannot separate Judaism from Kabbalah. Maimonides had this philosophical tradition some people follow, But in that period already, 12, 13, 1400s, Kabbalah is taking over, but it becomes the official theology of Judaism by 1500. And you can't separate it. That is a very important element for any historian, and it's a challenge for any historian because it's part and parcel of our prayer book. Every synagogue in the world says L'chadodi, made by a Kabbalist. The whole ritual of greeting Shabbat was developed by the Kabbalists in the 1500s, ended up in your prayer book. I think that, how food has to have warning labels. People have to have understanding of where their prayer book came from, where their theology came from. This is getting a little taste of where things come from and how they've come to be, because you walk into a synagogue, oh, it's always been this way, L'chadodi. No, it's 500 years old. What's it about? Oh, it's about the Shabbos queen represents the feminine nature of the divine. And there is this unification taking place between God as he is transcendent and the way divine energy is in the world, which is the idea of the queen of Shabbat being united with the king. Whoa, that sounds like paganism. This is why it's very dangerous, the mystical, and why one has to read it with understanding what the symbols mean and why they are necessary. In other words, there's a reason for this. Yes?
Well, as far as the liturgy goes, Talmudists were formulating that. Not what it is today, but a lot of the prayers come from what, Talmudists were.
Oh, of course. So you have, of course, the Amidah, the blessings before the Shema, but they were from the pre-Talmudic period, some of it. My point only is, you assume that our prayer book is as old as the men of the Great Assembly, which is 2,500 years ago, and it's true. The fundamentals are, but there were things that were added in this later period. They are treated differently. When someone's aware of it, oh, you see it has a different status. But my point is, even that, for example, the blessings before the Shema, when we are going up to heaven, basically, and we have the angels here saying, holy, 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 Lord of hosts. This language is from Kabbalistic literature that we're going to encounter of that Talmudic period, about people that would enter up into, they were called the riders of the chariot, or they were called those who would go into the chambers above. So this language is in our prayer book. Some of it is very, very mystical. And then over the next 2,000 years, it was down to our day, there were certain things that were tweaked or added into the prayer book, or words that were chosen because of Kabbalistic reasons. Numbers of words in every prayer, how many numbers it should be, what it should begin with, what language it should use, because there were variant texts. So sometimes choosing that. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I want to be able to come back here. So here's the issue. Take a look at this reading in our text. It's from Maimonides. Maimonides is basically claiming that the tradition has been lost. Take a look at text number 1 on 235. Jonas, do you want to read?
As you're well aware, even the Talmud, which was received by tradition, was not originally committed to writing in a book that was disseminated to the people. Now, care was taken to avoid writing the oral Torah in a book accessible to all because of the disadvantages in such a system. Certainly then no portion of the esoteric teachings of Torah could be written, which would divulge these teachings to everyone.
If the oral Torah was supposed to stay oral, even the legal, which everyone had to have access to, how much more so was there an oral tradition? Maimonides is writing about the mystical. He doesn't call it the mystical, metaphysical, whatever term you want to use. All right, take a bit further.
Rather, these teachings were orally communicated by a few uniquely qualified individuals to other uniquely qualified individuals. As I explained earlier, saying the secrets of Torah can only be entrusted to the skilled sages.
And then he continues, it's not here, but we spoke about it last week. And then because of persecution and suffering, we lost some of those meanings of that transmission because it was only said to individuals. It wasn't large groups. How do you keep something from being lost? If you give everybody a piece of the pie, guys, we're trying to cross the border. Everyone take a copy of my book. There's a chance of it getting through. But if you give it to one guy and give it to another guy, you're going to lose stuff. Now we have in the Talmudic writings, we have the little hints. We have the breadcrumbs that have to be expanded. And they're links, they're memory links, they're mnemonic devices to great mystical ideas, many of the stories of the Talmud. But the interpretation of those things, Maimonides says, has been lost. And then take it further.
Nothing but a few remarks and allusions to these teachings can be found in the Talmud and the Midrash. They are like small kernels enveloped in many husks, so that the reader is generally occupied with the husk without thinking that it includes.
So you read these stories in the Talmud about how this rabbi goes up to heaven and he sees this sort of thing, and you don't even know what it's talking about. Or sometimes you have midrashim which seem like a fable. They're alluding to mystical ideas. So now Maimonides, just by the way, even though people call him an arch rationalist, he really isn't. He believes that you can become a prophet, and he believes that you could connect to the mind of God through angels, and that is what prophecy is. And it seems very clear. The person he wrote the book, the guide for the perplexed for, his student Joseph, there's letters from Joseph complaining to Maimonides, you promised to teach me to be a prophet, and that didn't happen yet. And Maimonides rebukes him. You're grabbing for too much. You're not ready yet. In other words, there's a whole idea, the book Guide for the Perplexed, if you look closely, a lot of it's about prophecy. And in his book of Jewish law, he describes how one could be a prophet. And it's very clear to many, including academics, that Moses Maimonides wanted to become a prophet. He believed that you could reach this level even without necessarily being part of this Kabbalistic chain. He seems to claim that we don't have that secret wisdom, but he believes he could rebuild it from the Talmud or from the Midrashim, and that you could come to an understanding of how this is done. As a matter of fact, even attests at times that I had a bolt of lightning about the book of Job, an interpretation. When he says bolt of lightning, that's the language he uses for prophetic insight. That's some form of inspiration. My point only is, even though Maimonides is seen as an arch rationalist, if you read closely, he'd be more a mystical rationalist. In other words, he believed that using the mind, you could reach the highest places to a place above the mind, where God will then interact with the faculty of imagination, and you'll get prophecy. Yes, Dr. Lubchenko.
So the notion that the age of prophets is over, or we're a certain different age, is it because these techniques have been lost and you can recover them and you can still have prophets? Or is it just a different kind of prophecy?
So when we say the age of prophecy is over, it doesn't mean that there's no more prophecy. So there's an interesting book by Avram Yeshua Heschel. Avram Yeshua Heschel is from JTS. He's the one that marched with Martin Luther King. He came from a Hasidic background, and he wrote a book called The Prophets, but he wrote another small book called Prophecy in the Middle Ages and Maimonides, where it's a translation of 2 Hebrew essays, where he collects from many sources of sages in the Middle Ages that believed that they were achieving prophecy. And even the Gaonic period, we have techniques where they would try to have those visions. So point is, and then there's another book, which I mentioned in Middle Ages, there was a book called Responsive from Heaven. And this rabbi would write certain names of God or angels, whatever it was, and when he would go to sleep, he'd put his questions under his pillow, and in the morning it'd be written. Whether he wrote it in his sleep or it was a miracle, doesn't matter. But the point was, he was asking questions of Jewish law. So the other rabbis and he himself agreed, this doesn't have the status of Jewish law from heaven being revealed. It has to fit in a logical argument. But there's a wonderful introduction to this book by a Rabbi Ruve Margolius, who lived in the 60s and 70s in Israel, and he earlier in Poland. But he writes a beautiful introduction where he describes all these different types of prophetic insight that existed in Talmudic time and post-Talmudic. Elijah the prophet appears and teaches you. He's long dead, or he was long been in heaven. He's long been an angel. He comes down. They hear, like we studied the first week, they hear an echo from heaven, a bas kol, that God is communicating to them. In other words, there's dreams, there's visions, there's prophecy of some sort. It's of a lower level. So this idea that did not stop totally, Ruach HaKodesh, which means divine inspiration, is clearly seen as potential to be there. Is Israel the best place for it to happen? When there is a temple, yes, there are arguments like that. The temple is like this great repository, this great attraction for the mystical experience. And that as we go further away from Israel, further away from the destruction of the temple, the voices get fuzzier, but not that it's totally gone. In addition, the tradition, Maimonides writes in his letters, talking to other Jewish communities, there's a tradition that prophecy is going to begin to return to the Jewish people before the Messiah comes. And Maimonides is right. It has begun to return in our time already. And he attests to rabbis living in the time of his father who are having prophetic experience. This is Maimonides, who people call the arch rationalist. He's really not. Although he does use Aristotelian thought to explain everything, he is using Aristotle, but he is very much in this realm of God communicating with man is a possibility, and divine inspiration of insight beyond my logical mind is a possibility. And of course, the mystics are gung-ho on that. But my point is, there isn't really so much of a difference in that idea of prophetic insight. So even if Maimonides is a rationalist, he's not really, he's a mystical rationalist. In other words, he's using the mind for mysticism. Okay, Maimonides is important, although it's be more as a contrast, as we'll see, because everything after Maimonides, people deal with his issues. Okay, so there was this vision that study of Kabbalah without prior preparation and guidance can be dangerous. Take a look at this next reading. Mr. Levchenko, do you want to read? Four who entered the orchard.
Okay.
This is on page 236. Or maybe 237, 236? So Mr. Levchenko, you want to read? That's okay.
Sorry. Four things entered the orchard. Benazai, Ben Zoma,
Acher.
and Rabbi Akiva. Then Isaiah looked and died. Then Zamal looked and went mad. Acher cut down the plantings, became a heretic. Rabbi Akiva entered in wholeness and peace and emerged in wholeness and peace.
Oh, this is the Talmud discussing the idea of ascent of the soul to the higher realm. And what the Talmud says is that these four great sages in the period of the destruction of the temple, or afterwards, go up to Paradis. Paradis literally means orchard. They go up into the heavenly spheres. One of the sages goes mad, one dies, one becomes a heretic, and one, Rabbi Akiva, goes in peace and comes out in peace. What does this mean?
They didn't have pure soul.
Well, the issue is they went so high beyond their capacity to handle. So, for example, Elisha ben Avuya, who's Rabbi Meir's teacher, is great sage, he becomes a heretic. Now, the rabbis psychoanalyze him on their couch, where they talk about why he went off the path, things he experienced, things he saw, things his family raised him with, things that he did. They're all trying to understand how this greatest sage of that period could go off the path and become a heretic. But the catalyst is seen as this event where he's up in heaven and he goes and he sees things that he believes is more than one God. He sees angels and he thinks that they're divine, that they're God himself. And he thinks, therefore, there's more than one God. He gets this type of confusion of what's happening, and he becomes a heretic. He says later on, he heard a voice that says, everyone could return except for Elisha ben Avuya. That's why he's called the other. Acher means the other. He's the rabbi of Rabbi Meir, one of the greatest rabbis. He's the teacher of Rabbi Meir. So whenever Rabbi Meir is mentioned in the Mishnah, many a time they'll call him Acherim, the other one says, because his teachings he got from this man who became a heretic. They said about Rabbi Meir, he would take the kernel of wheat and leave the husk. In other words, he was able to filter from his teacher even later, which is very problematic and very dangerous. But point being, if here the greatest sages couldn't handle the heat, that tells you that real mystical experience can be something that could be traumatic or not understood. Now, this is experience. We're talking now about theology. We're talking about the ideas. But what they did was actually go into another dimension of being. and they were together, so to speak, and they see certain things.
Did
So-
they meditate together?
So somehow, I don't know the technique. If I did, I would not be sitting here. I would be up there. Although what's interesting, Maimonides, by the way,
They must have been meditating.
absolutely, Maimonides describes, for example, about how the wise person is supposed to act. But even when he's dealing with material, physical things, his mind is always connected to God. There's no anger. He's never upset. He's always binding his mind to God on high. And then if God will give him the blessing, he can then see things further. But this is something different. This is somehow doing some sort of meditative techniques, and they describe it. The Gaonim say that there were techniques. They would put their head between their knees. It's hard to know what technique they used, but there were for sure techniques.
I was just wondering
And-
how they went.
Right. So in other words, they're physically here, but somehow they go and take this journey together, which means it's not just an individual. I would just say prophecy in Judaism is seen as a real experience, not just a subjective personal experience. Because if it's subjective and personal, you can't really take the trip together. So this is not like everyone taking LSD together because you could have a bad trip. These guys had a very bad trip, but this wasn't something artificial. In other words, there's something here. Now, this is not what Kabbalists are trying to do most of the time. There were some who described their experiences later on, but most of the time, Jewish mysticism does not deal with biographies of their personal experiences. Most of the time, it's dealing with explaining what mitzvahs accomplish, how God interacts with the universe, and the interplay of history and Torah and all these type of ideas. So it's more theology than actual practical. But first, we're saying that the practical part is fraught with danger, but even the theology can be misunderstood.
Are they even contemporaries?
Yeah, they were. These four were. The 10 martyrs take place over a longer period of time, and that's seen more as poetic, that description, as being more of a unfolding of a spiritual decree against that generation. They're the same generation, but they weren't exactly contemporaries. But these four are all buddies. They know each other. All right, so what is the Pardes? This esoteric secrets of the Torah and a garden of spiritual delights. It can be an overwhelming experience regardless of spiritual status. But why are the ideas dangerous of Kabbalah? Here's the issue. The Torah works very hard to take the physical, tangible, God's hand, God's throne. The sages are busy reinterpreting to explain to you what it means, that you shouldn't think God has a body. The mystics go and they use metaphor related to God interacting with his attributes, king and queen. These things, if you read them simply, they could sound like pagan myths, and one has to be very careful. Chassidism came along and made these ideas much more accessible for the average person, but we'll get to that in a minute. But you have to be careful when we're reading these texts. If you read it without commentary, without a teacher, you can lose sight and think that the shell, the parable, is the thing itself. Like, I don't want to even give examples. We'll get to when we do some text. Okay, so let's go a little bit further. So Kabbalah deals with the most fundamental truths, but when misunderstood, they can be distorted and become destructive. So I want to get the map that's in our book. So what changes? So Hasidism translates Kabbalah into language comprehensible for everyone. In your book, there's a map on page 238. So I want to take this journey with you, going through the different Kabbalists a little bit. So if you took it to the left, figure 6.2, starting from the left, the vision of the chariot. You see that? You see everything? So the vision of the chariot, Ezekiel and other prophecies, even in the Torah itself, we read it last week. We read about how the sages see God sitting on a throne and they gaze. So you have that. Then you have these books written from the Mishnaic period, composed, when they're actually written down. You have the book of Bahir, of brilliance, attributed to Nechunya ben Akana, the Heichalot on the bottom left, which are chambers. So this vision of Ezekiel, where they see the chariot of the divine, so that becomes a generic term for much of Kabbalah, which is the Merkava. Merkava is the chariot, and much of early mysticism is called the Merkava mysticism, the Merkava Kabbalah, which deals with explaining Ezekiel's vision. he's seeing these entities that hold up God's throne, and there's a form of a man sitting on the throne. All that is Ezekiel's vision, and the later mystics explain it as meaning something very specific. Okay, so then you have the Book of Formation on top. We were talking about this book is attributed to Rabbi Akiva, although the teachings of it are seen even coming from Abraham. This book, when you read any of these books, they are written poetically, cryptic form. They don't make sense without commentary. We could read a selection of one of them from the Zohar. There are things that don't make sense. With commentary, all of a sudden, you see how every word is an allusion to another idea. But these were being written in manuscript form for Kabbalists, teaching other Kabbalists. So it was no longer verbal. It was now in manuscript form, beginning to become popular in the 1300s. They may have existed as scrolls before. They're written by Rabbi Akiva or composed by Rabbi Akiva or other Mishnaic sages. They are attributed to. So, but these are old books that exist in many different communities of the Jewish world where they have these traditions about these works. So some people wrote philosophical commentaries to these books. In other words, those who weren't mystics have these books too. In other words, the Book of Formation, which the earlier sages said that the mystics were able to create things of the physical world using the names of God, using this Book of Formation. This is how God creates the world, and these tools are given over to human beings. What that means exactly for us, the Talmud describes a rabbi who would make a sheep. I don't know what he was doing exactly in his laboratory. The point is, this was the first Dolly story. The first cloning, if you will, but it wasn't cloning. There was some sort of entity where they were able to create these. This is what the Talmud tells us. So I'm just saying this book, Yetzirah, but it's not just practical magic, if you will. It is describing how God creates the world and sustains the world, but in very poetic form and very illusion. And people wrote commentaries to it because they saw it as sacred. This is the Book of Formation. Then you have the Zohar. The Zohar shows up in 1240, 1260, the Moshe de Leon in the 13th century, and there was some question. Okay, where did this come from? And he said this wisdom came from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and not just that, elements of this book were quoted in earlier works as well. So academics today struggle. You had one approach of Gershon Shalom, and many of his students followed, that it was all written by Moshe de Leon, and he claimed it was an ancient work. Others say there's no way he didn't have the capability. We see his other writings. We can track his literary career. There's no way he wrote this sort of book. Experts in Kabbalah can read and look and see that. So other academics will say there are elements of other earlier books that are folded into it. The traditional approach is that this is from the school of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, his students, and then their students, and then was edited later on in the period of the Gaonim. So in general, it was accepted among the Jewish world as being of that period, of that Mishnaic, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai period, Rabbi Akiva, that period, the Mishnaic and Talmudic period. That's where it comes from. But all those are the ancient works. And then above, we have 4 different schools that develop. You have in Germany a school develops called Chassidei Ashkenaz. These are not Hasidim like us. These are mystics in Germany, the Rhine Valley, who are students of Rashi and Rashi's grandchildren. And they count every letter of the prayers, and they have names of God, traditions, again, and meditative techniques. A lot of this stuff we don't have necessarily today, understanding what it is. But these things end up filtering into other systems that then become explained. Right now, if you were reading this text without knowing the background, they're just symbols. They're not a cohesive whole for an outsider reading them. Not until they're explained in some way. So you have the schools, the mystics, and then you have.
Did they read books? Did they read writing?
Yes, we have their writings today. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, some of the stuff is written. They lived a very ascetic lifestyle. They had practical mysticism for the masses of how do you lead a life of holiness. Holiness, living beyond the letter of the law, but mixed with Kabbalah. In other words, certain ideas were merged. So there are books with their teachings about how cruelty to animals. They were very careful not to even kill a mosquito or a dog not to hit a dog that was barking at you or something. No, they had all these extra beyond the letter of the law type of sensitivity about how you treat other people, how you treat animals, how you treat the world, how you treat yourself, and also purity of thought, purity of sight, purity and engagement, male and female. So there were these ideas that are developing there, and they have their mystical tradition. It doesn't seem there are 4 different schools existing at the same time that don't seem directly related. In other words, you have going on Avram above, look at above the line, 1165, the great antagonist of Maimonides in Jewish law. He's in Provence. He's in Avram ibn Ben David of Pasquare is the Ravid. He's older than Maimonides, and he's a great mystic already. And they all claim they have traditions, by the way. They say we have traditions from our parents and grandparents. There's not stuff we're making up. All these groups are claiming that independently. And these are the same rabbis who are the carriers of our Jewish legal tradition that we trust. So this comes down to, ultimately with Kabbalists, you have to, if you don't trust them, then they have no authenticity. Ultimately, you have to trust them. Even Hasidism. The famous story, a guy came to the Rebbe and said, a Rebbe, I think it was the Rebbe, maybe it was a Rebbe, came to a Rebbe and said, I had a dream that I should become a Rebbe. So that Rebbe said to him, the Hasidim have to dream that you should be a Rebbe. You can't dream that you should be a Rebbe. You need followers. The followers have to want you. But the same thing with accepting the authenticity of traditions. If someone didn't accept these people as being a crackpot or being outside the loop, they wouldn't be accepted. And there truly were some that were seen as being too radical. But that's another thing. There are 3 primary ways that mystical teachings are seen to be transmitted in Judaism. You have, from Moses, somehow a body of knowledge that's being transmitted student to student. Just like the revealed Torah, there's a concealed hidden Torah being transmitted orally. Okay, that we can deal with. The problem is there's another type, which is my own prophetic experience. I see things in heaven. I go up to heaven and I see what the accomplishment of this mitzvah is. Wow. I have to trust your personal vision. Now, again, this doesn't affect Jewish law in general. This is just about mystical insights. So that's the second layer. The third layer is they had techniques of interpretation, just like the sages in the Talmud had techniques of interpretation to extract meaning from biblical stories or analyze mitzvot. So we don't know necessarily which one of the 3 is happening here when you read a mystical work. Was this a revelation transmitted from Moses? Was this some sort of prophetic experience that they had right now that Elijah appeared to them, revealed to them something new? Or was it some form of extrapolation from the text? Either way, those who follow the Kabbalists believe that they were authentic and they were reliable. Now, I would just say that all these different schools end up merging and impacting one another and becoming a useful theology for different groups of Jews in a similar way that Jewish law also develops in a certain way. When we learned Jewish law, you had Mishnah, you had Talmud, you had the codifiers, and you have different codes as they come down, and then you have a usable code that we have today. This usable code that we have today is a hybrid of many different approaches to Torah study, and you come to a conclusion. In theology, many groups came to the same thing. They come and they follow a certain path. If I'm a chassid, a Lubavitcher chassid, I am following a certain tradition of Kabbalah that goes down through Kabbalists to Hasidism. I would just say in the world today, pretty much everyone will follow what's called the Arizal, which we're going to get to. Take a look for a moment. I know I'm spending too much time, but I think the map is important for us to have an understanding. This period of the Middle Ages, Nachmanides writes the first biblical commentary that is accessible for everyone. He debates Rashi and Ibn Ezra, but he also puts in mystical secrets. He says, those who know the secret wisdom will know what I'm referring to, and it alludes to something, and he gives a hint. So in a book made for the masses are allusions to mystical teachings that he's putting out there for the public. Times are changing. They are seeing that it's important to spread mystical doctrine to some degree, more than it was in the past. Why? So some academics would say, well, Maimonides had just brought in Aristotle and the Greek philosophers, and the Kabbalists felt that that Jewish tradition is being watered down with this philosophy stuff when we have our own rich theology that I don't need to use Greek language for. That may be a possibility. Or Maimonides is part of, I don't want to get into analyzing Maimonides right now, but let's just for a moment, or for whatever reason, they see this as being necessary, as we're going to see different reasons for the unfolding of stages of Kabbalistic thought. Because Kabbalistic thought clearly went through evolutions, very clearly, how they felt it was sacred, it shouldn't be taught. Then it was taught to small groups with hints and allusions. Then it was more elaborated. And then it was systemized, and then it becomes down through Hasidism. So take a look. I'm gonna do the next page. So you have these 4 schools, and then these are their students taking place all at the same time. Basically, from 1150 to 1350 is this early Kabbalists. But what happens here, the next period of Kabbalists is in Tzfat. After the expulsion from Spain, 1492, you have this great explosion of Jewish mysticism coming from Tzfat. You have Shlomo Alkabetz, the rabbi who makes up L'Chadodi. He's a Kabbalist. The rabbi of the town Tzfat is Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. The first mystic there is the Moshe Cordovero, who is the Ramak, who writes the first systematic, organized Kabbalistic schemes. He pulls it all together and organizes everything in a way that you can now understand the structures. He takes from the Zohar, the Kabbalistic works, and he makes this infrastructure that you can now see a full picture of the spiritual cosmos. But what's happening here is that after Reb Moshe Cordovero dies, the Arizal, Yitzchak Luria, takes over for 3 years. 2-3 years, that's all he's a rabbi for there. And he revolutionizes the Jewish mystical tradition. He doesn't write anything himself. He has his student, Reb Chaim Vital, writes things down. He becomes the accepted channel for the Arizal. There were other students that wrote things, but they don't have necessarily the same consistent reliability in later generations. In later generations, the Arizal becomes the man. He has, and his students describe what sort of person he was. He in other words, visions, speaking to those who have passed on, understanding the sounds of creatures. Like we speak of King Solomon. I mean, wise, but also this mystical genius who takes the Zohar and makes it all accessible as well, and explains more. He has a different vision of the cosmos than Rav Moshe Cordovero. It's like another take, a deeper level, they would say. But either way, everything flows from him. And this becomes, he says it's a mitzvah to reveal this wisdom. He dies when he's 33, I believe. He dies very young. But in 3 years, he taught this mystical teachings that revolutionized the world. So by that point, philosophy had already hit pretty much a dead end. But already in the 1300s, they were already merging philosophical language with Kabbalistic ideas. And that's part of an interesting development, which happens from 1500 to the Hasidism, where you have these rabbis who would mix philosophy and Kabbalah, the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz, where they would take philosophical ideas and make symbolism and with Kabbalah and make it much more rational. How do you take these mystical ideas and put it in language that people can relate to? So there was a lot of that, and also very much dealing with the inner development of the human being as well, which leads to Hasidism. So Hasidism, the great opponent of Hasidism, anyone remember his name? Baal Shem Tov was the great proponent. The great opponent of the next generation, Vilna Gaon, the Vilna Gaon, right? Elijah of Vilna. But Elijah of Vilna was probably one of the greatest Kabbalists of his generation. The antagonist to Hasidism was a great Kabbalist. He took issue with Hasidism primarily because, number one, he felt it wasn't for the masses. Chassidism wanted to take Kabbalistic ideas and make it accessible for the masses. He felt that was not appropriate. He felt it was only for the holy and it was only for the pure. When you filled your belly with the meat and bread of the revealed Torah, of Jewish law and Jewish ethics, and then you could go to the Kabbalah, but it shouldn't be accessible for everyone. In addition, he was also concerned about the debacle of Shabtai Tzvi, a false messiah who used Kabbalistic ideas to promote to the masses that he was the Messiah.
That was like 100 years or something.
Earlier, 1666, right? So they were still burned by that because they felt that mass movements of Kabbalah are dangerous. Plus, they thought Hasidism was going to reform Judaism. Ultimately, they saw the next generation and the generation after, they saw it wasn't true. They saw Hasidism were very into keeping Jewish law completely. So the rivalry and the contention that exists between the two groups subsided to a great degree.
Plus, they thought that Shabbat theism was going to make a comeback.
Well, there was, so this is an important element. Very good, that's a very important element. There already was a comeback. Frankistan, Shabtai Tzvi converts to Islam. And what happened under force of taking the turban, he was a false messiah in Turkey, and the Sultan gives him a choice. Either you take the turban or you get the sword. So he takes the turban, becomes a Muslim, and then his students say, well, he really still is the Messiah, but he has to go into the other religion to elevate the sparks of holiness. Taking some of these Kabbalistic ideas and making a perversion out of it. Later on, a real pervert, his name was Jacob Frank in Europe, he says, I'm the Messiah for the peasants, and he's like involved in all sorts of immoral activity. He ends up converting to Christianity and he ends up trying to get the Talmud burnt and things like that. He becomes a great antagonist to Judaism. So there was a resurgence in the beginning of the Hasidic movement, and there still was what they would consider crypto-Shabtai Tzvinik people. There were people that were still crypto-Septanians that were beneath the surface. You didn't know who they were necessarily. So there was a lot of paranoia out there because there was a lot of witch hunts or not witch hunts because it had spread so quickly and so deeply. So it really traumatized the Jewish world. There was another thing going on for Hasidism. Hasidism saw the world was in a state of deep coma. The Jewish people, after the disappointment of that false Messiah, that they really believed it was going to happen, many of them. Plus the Khmelnytsky massacres taking place in Ukraine that really decimated 2,000 Jewish towns, whatever the numbers are, incredible numbers. The people were then, after that, poverty-stricken. Many had been killed, many relatives wounded, raped, all these terrible things. They were in a state of depression. The Baal Shem Tov was seen as how do you lift up the spirits of the Jews? The Hasidism wanted to get the Jew who was not the greatest scholar to feel part of it. Now, there were great scholars that were part of Hasidism, but the common folk felt very distant from their religion because of the fact that Judaism had created an aristocracy of learning. And if you weren't a great scholar, so then you were low on the totem pole. Hasidism said, you know what? Sincerity, pray with passion, love of one's fellow, love of God, all these things which are part of Judaism, they accentuated that even the simple folk can have a connection to, or the less educated because of persecution. They weren't necessarily simple, they were less educated maybe. But then the elite were also involved in the mystical. So what you have is this type of fraternity that grows around their rebbes that becomes the Hasidic movement. Now, in the Hasidic movement itself, there was great debate of how much the mystical should be taught to the common folk, if you're not yet a scholar. Even among Hasidim, there was a big debate. It wasn't so simple. So, as a matter of fact, in every period of expansion of Hasidic and Kabbalistic thought, there is pushback about, is this appropriate, is this wise to or not? We're going to look at why this was seen as being a positive. In other words, there was something seen of expanding these teachings as being a positive thing. When the Maggid Mezritch dies, the success of the Baal Shem Tov, 60 of the students spread out and they open up Hasidic centers around Eastern Europe. This is where Hasidism spreads and begins to spread. This is the period, so to speak, after the Baal Shem Tov's successor passes on, and each one of these become groups. Here's just a quick table here. I mean, you can't really see it, the screen is too small, but if you look, the the large red box, the red boxes are each town that has more than 50% Hasidism. And the green boxes are less than 1% Hasidim. So Vilna is the arch Litvak anti-Hasidic headquarters. That's a big square on the top. Warsaw is the big Hasidic. Most 50% of the Jews in Warsaw are Hasidim. But here, this will give you a better understanding. The blue up here is Chabad, Lubavitch. Chabad is, and down below are other Hasidic groups. So the big orange circle all the way to the left is Ger. That's a very big one, or Gur. But what's interesting about Chabad, just a little aside, Chabad, as you see, is isolated from all the other groups. So most Jews who came out of Russia, we were talking earlier, in the 1880s, 1890s, they were coming from Hasidic backgrounds, most of them, or at least 60, 70%, because that's the Hasidic background was Chabad in Russia, pretty much. You do have Chernobyl; those are the small yellow circles below, but they're not up in the Pale of Settlement to the same degree. They're not as far up the major circles. So what's interesting is Chabad developed isolated from other Hasidic groups, which allowed it to have its own unique path. Other Hasidic groups were always constantly bouncing off each other, intermarrying with each other, the families, the different groups affected each other. Chabad was able to have its own pathway. And even in Brooklyn, and much later, Crown Heights today is just Chabad. Chabad are non-religious people and African Americans. In other words, it's just an interesting development that allowed it to have a strong foundation that was able to keep its focus, so to speak, and be less diluted, if you will, or less impacted by others, for better or worse. That's just an interesting critique one can understand of how Chabad developed. Oh, so the pink is Karlin. They daven out loud voices. Matisyahu was once involved with Karlin. A lot of these groups are not so big anymore. This is in the period of 1900 to 1939. Karlin Stolin is the pink. He was the musician. He's a singer. He was for a while. That was his thing. But the idea of crying out to God with great passion, that's one of them. He was Chabad too. Yeah, he was Chabad too. He went through different stages in his spiritual journey. The artists are artists. Okay, I don't want to get too far out with this question. So the idea of trusting the teacher, I would just say, is that there were students of the Arizal from the 1500s that went and traveled all the way into the 1600s throughout Germany and Poland, spreading these Kabbalistic ideas, publishing books. Ultimately, by the way, there was a strong manuscript culture coexisting with a print culture in the early period of the printing press, because things that were meant to be secret or a more insular group was still done in manuscript. For 200 years and even more, people have manuscripts. The Hasidic masters, many of the Rebbe's writings are just in manuscript. People wouldn't print them. They would just copy them. The only reason the Tanya is printed is because people are either forging it to make problems. The anti-Hasidic groups are adding in things, so therefore it's no longer accurate, or people are not copying well, so they decide to print it. In general, there was hesitation about print. In other words, you have oral transmission, teacher-student group transmission, manuscript transmission, and then you have print. Once it's print, it's forever. It changes the whole dynamics. And some would blame the printing press on the spread of Kabbalah to such a crazy degree where it becomes everywhere. Because before the printing press, to do it, there was a much more hesitancy. It also ended up in Christian hands. The Christians took Kabbalah and they got into it and translated into Latin and to other things, and they took parts of it as well. And many rabbis are very upset with that. But then they felt, on the other hand, okay, we have to make sure we have accurate text out there. We better print the right stuff now that we're forced to, almost. So I just want to share a story. Well, let's do a reading here. A reading first. Dr. Levchenko, would you read for us on page? There is a reading. Here it is. Okay. Text 3, I'm going to paraphrase, and then you're going to read text 4. Text 3 is saying that there's a contradiction in the description of the Ten Commandments. It says, a great voice came and did not end. And when God spoke the Ten Commandments, and the term Vayasaf did not end, could be read as was never repeated. That the Ten Commandments was said once and never again. And then on the other hand, others read it the exact opposite, that the voice of God never stopped resonating. You just have to hear it. You have to have an antenna to pick it up. So Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz says that it's true. All subsequent revelations were already set at Mount Sinai, but it's in the ether. Sometimes it's floating. And the sages, Moses may have heard it, but the sages now reveal it to the world because it's a unique time for it. In other words, there's an unfolding of the mystical, and even not the mystical, even how things develop. There can be an unfolding where it gets revealed to the world at a certain point in history, either through extrapolation or through other means that comes along. In other words, there is a logic, gunpowder. The Chinese found it way before the West did, but it was used for fireworks. It doesn't become part of society until much later. I'm sorry? Right, the dynamite. Leonardo da Vinci came up with ideas that weren't used for hundreds of years later. In other words, sometimes ideas don't stick. The time is not yet right. There are things that are happening now that people had thought of in science fiction, Asimov or others had come up with, and all of a sudden are happening now in science. So in other words, sometimes it's because the time is not yet right. That's the belief, that things unfold sometimes in a certain way. All of a sudden, the breakthroughs, somehow the exact same. Here's a story from Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo, the one who composed the Code of Jewish Law, he's breaking his head to understand a Talmudic problem, and he finally gets the solution. He walks into the Beit Medrash the next day, and he hears these young men discussing it, and one of them casually gives his resolution that he broke his head over to try to come up with. The guy gives it casually to his friend, and he's all downcast. I broke my head for days, weeks, trying to resolve it, and this guy just came up with it intuitively. So his vision angel, the Maggid, tells him, don't feel bad. You brought it into the world, and once you brought it into the world, others are coming up with it too. In science, Dr. Levchenko, tell me if I'm wrong, all of a sudden, there are breakthroughs in areas that somehow the same exact time, we don't even know who came up with it. They're so close to each other. Synchronicity, right? Synchronicity, so divine providence is what we call it. But here we're saying even deeper. Here we're saying like the idea that one person pulls it into the world, so to speak. But either way, the idea that things unfold in the proper way. But there's another reading. Take a look at text 4, if you don't mind, Dr. Levchenko.
Text 4.
245.
On Rosh Hashanah of the year 55 of 1746, my soul ascended to the higher worlds. I rose level after level until I reached the chamber of Mashiach. Asked Mashiach, when will the master come? He answered, by this you will know, when your teachings will become known and revealed throughout the world, and your wellsprings will be spread to the outside.
So he has a mystical experience where he writes this in a letter to his brother-in-law living in Israel, Gershon Kitover. Now the letter was lost, so he rewrote it and sent it again. But these letters got published in Hasidic works. It happens to be in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. They have an original in Baal Shem Tov's handwriting of this letter. So the letter may have been written and copied. So there are slight variations. That's how they explain the variation of the letter. But there are 2 or 3 versions of this letter where he describes how his soul had an ascent. He thought he died. He said, I see all these souls coming towards me. I thought I died. He didn't realize, and he wasn't sure, was he having an ascent of the soul or was he dead? So now we know what it feels like. I don't know. But he didn't know what was happening. And then he goes up level after level. He describes how he's helping these souls. He's elevating other souls. That's another whole idea of lifting up souls who are in trouble, that he helps them with his prayers. But he comes up to the chamber of Messiah. He said, I've never come so high. Messiah is a soul waiting to be vested in a body. You find this in the Talmud as well. Messiah existing in the world as a person. And this here and other places in heaven, the soul of Messiah. In other words, one reading is Messiah down here is a regular great Torah scholar or leader. And when God chooses to send the Messiah, he's going to take this soul and put it into an existing body of a great leader or sage. That's one reading of it. But either way, that's not important for this conversation. What's important for this conversation is that he asks the Messiah, when will you arrive? And Messiah says, when your well springs will spread forth.
When you're what?
Well springs, your teachings of Kabbalah, of the mystical, will spread forth. That's when the Messiah will come. Why? Because the inner secrets of the Torah are the recognition that God is everywhere, God is present, it's the knowledge of God. We say Maimonides concludes his laws of Messiah, how he concludes his book, with a quote from the prophet that says, when Mashiach will come, the world will be filled with the knowledge of God as waters cover the seabed. This idea that there's going to be a flood of knowledge of God before the Messiah comes is seen as intrinsic to Messiah. It is what Messiah is about. Because Messiah is not just Mashiach in Jewish thought, is not just no more suffering, no more war, no more bloodshed, and Jews returning to Israel. But all of humanity will be able to perceive and see the divine. So for the Kabbalists, that's what we're all about. The Kabbalists are all about seeing the divine. And even more so, the Hasidic masters. The Hasidic masters taught, I'll just go through on one foot. The philosophers taught that God is unique and different from anything else. When we say God is one, we mean he is different from anything else. We cannot know God for the philosopher. We can know what God is not. We can define God by what he's not what he is. God, his essence is not describable. Along comes the Kabbalists and say it's true. God, the way he is not describable, but God creates an interface for us where he emanates from himself what we call the divine emotions. God has the ability to limit his flow that we can relate to. That's how he creates the divine emotions. And that's how we can relate to God, and God is showing us love. We're going to do a little analysis of this concept in a moment. The Hasidic masters come along and say that it's not just that God's divine flow of energy is reaching us in the world, but every part and parcel of the physical universe are just expressions of divine will. There is no, it's not pantheism. We don't say the world is God. We say that the world is totally dependent on God and being spoken into existence by God, that the true state of all things is nothingness, and the unity of divine means there is no true reality other than God. So for the mystic, for the Hasidic mystic, what he's saying is that the physical world is an expression of God hiding his energy, so that just like if you took a microscope and you would see these are atoms in this table, they would say the atoms which are physical are really being sustained by a spiritual energy. And that spiritual energy is the will of God. And if God stopped willing into existence, everything would stop. So what's the point? They had a radical idea of the unity of God. When they say, hero is the Lord of God, the Lord is one, they don't mean there's just one God. No, they're closing their eyes. They're saying there is no true reality other than God. In other words, everything, everybody is an expression of divine energy. Everything happening in the world at any moment is part of the divine will. Everything has been sustained and kept around by God. The heavens above, the earth below, and everything in between are just expressions of the divine. So when I say God is one and I close my eyes, I'm not acting like I've died and gone to heaven, which is one approach, willing to give your life for God, close your eyes. No, I'm closing out the entire world, because all that exists is the divine. Then I open my eyes and I say, blessed be the name, the glory of his kingdom forever and ever. I recognize that there is a world, and God made a world that is fragmented, is differentiated. We are different people. We're not all one. There are different things, but my job is to reveal God in the fragmented universe. In other words, the whole point for the mystic, that is a chassid, is not that up in heaven we're accomplishing great things. The Kabbalists want to accomplish things in heaven. Every time you do a mitzvah down here, you accomplish something in heaven. You're causing things to happen. The chassid wants God's reality to be found in every part of the physical world as well. What were you going to say, Dr. Lochenko? Okay, so for the chassid, there is no separation between God and the physical world. The physical world is not just the shell and evil and negativity. The physical world is now an expression of the divine. Earlier mystics would be ascetics. They would say, leave behind the skin of the snake, leave behind the physical, fast, mortify yourself. The Hasidim said, look, don't indulge because then you're feeding your animal soul. But everything in the physical world is an opportunity to reveal God in the physical world. So there's a change that takes place in Hasidism. So Hasidism also has another idea. Here's the thing. Many people looked at Hasidism as Kabbalah for dummies. You know, it's like Madonna doing today. We're gonna make it easy, we're gonna make it easy for people to understand. Hasidism didn't view itself as that. It did say that we will try to make it accessible to people, but it saw itself as something much more. It saw itself as being a deeper understanding of these mystical teachings, because for the mystics were busy talking about heaven, how this world is not so important. The Hasidic mystics, Hasidism, was saying, no. The ultimate reality is down here, that we can reveal the divine in this realm. And they said something even deeper, and this is a bit radical. Hasidism sees itself as being deeper than Kabbalah. It believes that the idea of Hasidism is to unify all the different genres of learning that we were talking about until now. Talmud, revealed Torah, hidden Torah, different approaches to philosophy, to show the unity of it all. It believes that we can show, if it's all one Torah, we can reconnect the broken parts. Just like I can recreate the broken parts of the world by revealing everything is one with God and the parts of myself that are fragmented, so too Torah can be a unified whole. So Hasidism saw itself, and in particular Chabad Hasidism, as being about revealing the inner core that unites all different parts. You could see at the end of the book, there's a reading where the Rebbe explains how you could read Moda Ani in 4 different dimensions. That's the prayer you say when you wake up in the morning. And then a 5th dimension, which is Hasidism, which sheds light on all the other 4 and also makes it applicable. So Hasidism sees itself as that final frontier of the unfolding of Kabbalah. So for Hasidism, this is a big question historians have, was Hasidism an attempt to dampen down messianic fervor of the Shabtai Tzvi age by making it personal redemption, as opposed to global redemption, which shook up the whole world? So some academics want to claim that. They want to say that Hasidism took all this messianic fervor and made it very personal about, are you going to redeem the sparks of holiness that are trapped in you and trapped in the world? But the way Hasidim see themselves, it's a combination of both. That by changing yourself and by changing the world around you, you elevate these sparks and you bring that messianic age, that messianic era, when God will be revealed in all things. So there's this unfolding, and there also is this unique stage. So Hasidism doesn't see itself just as Kabbalah for beginners, to use a nice phrase. It sees itself as being, yes, a step of mysticism, but also a deeper step in revealing the unity of all, basically the unity in people, unity in creation, unity in God, and unity in Torah. There is nothing else other than God. So if you would ask, what is the core line of Hasidism? That Alts is Gott and Gott is Alts. All is God and God is all. It's not pantheism, because pantheism, which is Spinoza, he says the physical world is what God is. That's all there is. The Kabbalists explained already, there's God the way he's transcendent, above all things, and then there's the way God is within all things. Hasidism comes along and says that this idea of God being both transcendent and God being both immanent is are all one and the same. It comes from it is one thing. In other words, there is no place empty of God. All that there is Hashem. So this changes everything. But that's what you're trying to always when you look at the world, that's what you're looking at. When you look at other people, that's what you're looking at. You're finding the divine in all things, in all people, in all places. Nothing is outside the circle. Even the thing that we call the other side, negativity, have some sparks of holiness being sustained by God for some reason, some purpose. All right, any thoughts before we do a conclusion?
And
Yes.
Maybe just to go back to some of the specific Kabbalistic ideas.
Yes,
Let's say God is everywhere, it permeates everything.
yes.
How can we reconcile with the idea of God limiting himself, right? Saying that, for the world to exist, there should be some sort of contraction, limitation, boundary placed between. Where is the boundary versus permeation?
Very good. So this was one of the big debates about between Hasidism, the way Hasidim saw it, and the antagonists about this question of God's contraction and concealment. For Hasidim, it was only apparent. In other words, God is just hiding himself from us. From his perspective, all that exists is the God. The world is not anything new for God. God did not change by creation of the world. It's just our perception. God is very hidden. So in other words, what makes the holy temple holy and this bathroom, to make a separation, not holy? Revelation of the divine. God is everywhere equally. The antagonists of Hasidism said, how could you put God in the bathroom? How could you say that there's no difference? You have to say that God is not there. And we said, God is everywhere, but he's concealed and hidden, so to speak. So it's all about concealment. Even the term contraction, we understand to mean a very deep concealment. So God is everywhere. The question, and the truth is, all the Kabbalists agree that God himself is everywhere and is not concealed or contracted. The question is his divine energy that he gives out. Is that concealed or is it contracted? It's a little bit technical, but let me just give to get to the meat of it. Here's the big question. What makes something holy? Why is the Temple Mount holy? Because there's more divine energy that's flowing there and people can sense it. But God himself is everywhere. So the question really then becomes, it's a question of perception. There are places where it's more transparent, places more concealed. That's why some people show up at the Temple Mount and they think they're the Messiah. They're having the Messiah complex. Because this is a technical medical term. People think they're the Messiah when they show up in Jerusalem, called the Messiah complex. Because somehow there's something being awakened in people when they come there. So this idea, though, we would say is the big question, so to speak, is that for the Chassid and even for the mystic, God himself is everywhere. The question is the divine energy that flows through the world. Is there a vacuum of that or is it concealed? So we're going to say it's just concealed. God is everywhere. So it's just a question of perception. But now here's what we say. Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, God is one. All that exists is God. I open up my eyes and I see a world. It's fragmented. God wants me to see the world like that. In other words, it's true that we are different in its fragmentation, but now I have to reveal godliness in those things. In other words, for some of those anti-Hasidic mystics, they said this idea that all that exists is God is a dangerous idea to have all the time. It's a dangerous idea because you don't have any boundaries, they would say. So we would say, look, reality has a way of smacking you in the face. In other words, reality has a way of showing you that there is a world, and this world is real. Now you have to struggle to overcome all the obstacles the world's come and say, okay, I see the divine in this. I see the divine in this. It's a constant battle, so to speak, and struggle to calibrate. So, but any issue one would have in life, anger, if everything is coming from God, it's very different. If everything is God, that means there's no challenge in my life that I'm not able to overcome. God gave it to me for a reason. Why? I don't know. But also I can see in every encounter, nothing is empty. There's no part of my life that's empty. Every encounter is part of that divine providence. God is bringing this world into existence for us at every moment. So let's take a quick look at one Hasidic idea if we have time. I don't know if we really don't. So you could read here, there'll be an unfolding of some of the Hasidic ideas. So I didn't really spend time with that. We'll have to make a decision. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on Wednesday nights, our regular Wednesday night classes in between the JLI. There's another one coming up, I think, in May, a 4-week course on Supernatural, which is, things like evil eye and superstition and things like that. But in between, we're going to start Wednesday nights. We'll do 7 to 8:30 at the house. We'll do a little more text-based than we did here. This was more sermon, more a speech, so to speak, on the history of things. We'll do a little more text. The question would be if there's any specific areas of interest that might be up your alley. I was thinking of doing texts related to the upcoming holidays. So we'll study the Megillah or the Haggadah rather, before Passover for a few weeks. The Passover Haggadah through different dimensions, but we'll study it inside. So we'll be doing it at my house with God's help. So, but if there's a different area of Torah learning you would like to explore, Talmud, Midrash, Chassidus, Kabbalah, we could pick ideas and do that with a text. I don't like without all the slideshow and all the shiny lights. I'm saying but with a text that we could study a little bit and discuss like we do Sunday morning type of thing. Any thoughts? Yes.
So I thought you were gonna get to this in this course, because it's in the book, the Sefer wrote.
Yes, I did not do it in this class, but we did it in the My God class. But on one foot, the idea of the Sefirot is how do we deal with the fact that God is so transcendent and you can't describe in any way? How do I deal with that if I'm going to Torah tells us how God loves me and how God gets upset when I do something wrong? So we say God creates this interface. That is the Sefirot. Is that interface, and we're in that image. That we have a body and a soul that resembles God's interface. So when God chooses to make a world, he first chooses to make himself. When I say himself, his interface, which is his divine energy being limited in certain ways. And the example given here from the Kabbalists is if you take water and put it into a cup that's red or blue, it will appear a certain way. But really, God, in other words, it's all God, but he just appears in different ways because of his power of contraction and concealment. That God basically, here's how it works. God, as he is transcendent, has both the infinite and the power of limitation. So when we say Hashem is Elokeinu, we mean God is both transcendent and he also has the ability to limit and contract.